Hey everybody, welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here, very excited about today's show. Denny ONeil is back. Denny is going to be at Terrificon on Sunday, the 19th, at Mohegan Sun, and I hope you get a chance to meet him and also hopefully purchase his new novel that came out earlier this year. The book is called The Perils of Captain Mighty and the Redemption of Danny the Kid. It's partially autobiographical. It's also a little fictional to protect the innocent, if you will. Denny is very candid. During a lot of his comic book career, he battled alcoholism. He talks about that briefly in today's conversation. We talked a lot about his book in our last conversation. Our first talk, we talked a lot about the question, and I kind of felt, man, let's talk Batman. We've never really sat down and had a chance to really talk about Batman. And this is our chance. Great stuff about when Denny was writing the Nightfall novelization. Great stuff about the famous story in Legends of the Dark Knight that he wrote called Venom. We talk a lot about the Nightfall event and when Denny first got hired by DC. Some stuff about Green Lantern and Green Arrow, the hard-traveling heroes. And lots of really interesting stuff about various stories, how Denny's real life might have influenced some of the things he wrote about. Of course, Speedy's addiction that we read about in Green Lantern and Green Arrow is covered as well. So I really can't tell you how much I appreciate Denny's time and insight in his own writings and also about the comic book business. We get a lot into what it was like in the Silver Age and Bronze Age, not only at DC and Marvel, but also even at Charlton Comics as well. And that Charlton talk is going to continue in another interview that's coming up with Paul Kupperberg. So as I said on social media, with Roy Thomas's interview last week, Denny's this week, I really feel like I've had an opportunity to get firsthand knowledge of some comic book history from the guys who lived it. And Denny ONeil is certainly one of those guys. It's great to have him back on today's Word Balloon. Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you very much for your support, League, through subscriptions at Patreon. If you'd like to subscribe to Word Balloon, if you're a listener and you enjoy the conversation I try to bring you each month, man, I'll tell you, we had a hell of a July, and August looks like it's going to be equally great. Not only, as I've said recently, some of the classic creators that I've had the opportunity to talk to, but a lot of current people as well are coming up in the days and weeks ahead. And the people that help make it possible through subscriptions to Word Balloon are the League of Word Balloon listeners. Do you think Word Balloon is worth $1 a month? Do you think it's worth the price of a comic book a month? If you do and would like to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/wordballoon or go to wordballoon.com and click on the Patreon ad. Thank you very much, League of Word Balloon listeners. Full transparency, you've heard the Terrificon ads. I'm going to be at Terrificon in just 2 weeks now, really under 2 weeks, the 17th through the 19th at Mohegan Sun in Connecticut. I'm telling you, this is a great show. All you have to do is go to Terrificon.com and check out the lineup. So many great current and past greats are going to be there. Amazing celebrities. The Fonz is going to be there. Daniel from The Karate Kid, the great actor Ralph Macchio is going to be there. Denny ONeil, Roy Thomas, Paul Kupperberg, so many great writers and artists. Also current stars like Nick Spencer, Charles Soule, C.B. Cebulski, Christopher Priest, Afua Richardson, Sarah Richard, my buddies Art and Franco. It's going to be a great time, and it makes up for the fact that I wasn't able to go to Comic-Con this year. And very, very excited to be there. I'm going to be doing 8 panels over the weekend, a couple on Friday, a couple on Saturday, and a couple on Sunday. So, again, full disclosure, that's why we've got the ad for Terrificon, and that's why we've been getting so many great classic creators in the last couple weeks, and that will continue leading up right through to Terrificon, and of course the panels will be featured on Word Balloon episodes after the show. So, with all that in mind, I wanted to remind you that it's a great time to advertise on Word Balloon. Great content, and Word Balloon reaches a wide national, in fact worldwide audience that I think would find your geek culture products or related industries worth hearing and hearing about. So if you have any interest in advertising on Word Balloon, now is the time. You can email me at john@wordballoon.com, and we can start a conversation. Reasonable rates and great content to put your ads on. So consider advertising on Word Balloon in the days and weeks ahead. Okay, without further ado, let's get into our conversation now with the great Denny ONeil. Wonderful to speak with him. He had a really rough year last year. He lost his wife, Mary Fran. We talked about it in our previous conversation. But he is on the mend, and he has this excellent book that he is promoting. And some of those troubles that he was dealing with at the end of last year and the beginning of this year kind of kept him from being able to promote the book. So I'm very excited that he will have copies at Terrificon. Hit him up. He's going to be there on Sunday, the 19th of August, at Terrificon at Mohegan Sun. And this is a great chance again. And also, it's available digitally on Amazon. And, so by all means, seek it out. It's a really, really great memoir of his life and career. So let's get into it now with Denny ONeil on Word Balloon. If you're ready, we'll dive in.
Splash.
Welcome back, Denny ONeil, to Word Balloon. As I was just telling you off the air, it's a pleasure to have you back, and I appreciate your clarity of memory and your stories. How are things going in terms of, last time we spoke, you had released your semi-autobiography, half fiction, half true tales, and how's the response been?
That book is the best-kept secret since the invasion of Normandy.
Oh, man. I'm assuming you're going to have the autobiography with you for Terrificon for people to buy and sign, I hope.
I guess I am. They only gave me 10 comps, and I pretty much gave all those away, so I bought 15 more copies. I do have some copies.
Great.
I don't know what to do about that book. I don't know even what I think about it. If you want to save yourself 5 years' worth of psychotherapy, write an autobiographical novel, because the feedback I have gotten, people remember things I didn't even know about because I did them in blackouts. And a lot of them are pretty bad, pretty ugly. But I had no memory of them until I get reminded, and then I realized, God, I was a prick. I could have been a monster.
Yeah, and then facing those kind of, past behavior and stuff, yeah, that's got to be humbling. Or is it because, again, these are memories that were blank, that they are kind of surprising, and I don't know, how do you process that?
You face them, and my ex-girlfriend has filled in a lot of blanks. My brother, Dave, and my brother Tom have filled in a lot of the blanks. It was worse than I thought. Wow. I don't quite know how I got through that without really damaging myself. But I did, and I don't know why some people are able to turn that corner and other people aren't. I didn't plan for the novel I wrote to be as much about drinking as it was, but if you're trying to write about that time in the history of comics, and you're trying to do it from one viewpoint, it's very hard. I mean, without completely making the whole thing up out of whole cloth, it's very hard to not acknowledge those things. So, 40% of the way through the book, I said, well, this is a battle that's not worth fighting. I will simply tell the story, and we'll see where it goes.
I wonder if when you were writing things like that famous Green Lantern, Green Arrow story about Speedy's addiction,
mm-hmm.
How much of it, were you in a place that you could, write about that kind of addiction? And were you in denial of your own issues, or, where was it in the context of your drinking? Did it inform that story at all?
It probably did. There is a couple of panels very early on in the continuity in which they mention that alcoholism is another form of addiction. I was at a point where I was getting drunk 5 or 6 nights a week. I now know that I was violent and ugly a lot of that time.
Wow.
But nobody was calling me an alcoholic yet. My mother went to her grave without putting my name and the word alcohol in the same sentence.
And what years were these? What decades were these that this was happening?
This is mostly the 70s.
Wow.
I mean, the novel started out as something very different than what it ended up as. And what I wanted to do was tell the story of how comics came of age.
Yeah.
My son was twisting one arm, and I guess Mary Fran was twisting the other, and they kept saying, "You should like your story." And I objected to that, but I finally agreed if I could combine it with a fantasy and not have any of my self-imposed rules, it would be an interesting thing to try. It's writing a novel the way we were taught in college novels are written, and they're mostly not written that way. But, sit down, wait for the angel of inspiration to light on your shoulder and whisper in your ear, and then make it up as you go along. I've written about 10 novels, only 2 did I make up as I was going along. And one, if I had my way, every single copy of that book in the world would vanish, would suddenly evaporate, because I certainly don't want anybody to read it who hasn't already, and it does have my name on the cover. That was, it was a pretty easy job to do, and I did have the experience of writing a novel, writing a science fiction novel. When that was completed and published, I realized I am now a science fiction writer. I have published a book that has been marketed as science fiction, and I don't know what an atom is. So I tried to fill in that huge gap in my education. I mean, I went to St. Louis U, and if you were an English major, you didn't take any science courses. You weren't allowed to.
Okay.
But it occurred to me, and I was right, that anybody who lives in our time, in our era, should know some science, especially if you're going to presume to write about it. So there was a book called 1, 2, 3, Infinity that was a popularization of Einstein's theories. And that book was a huge help and a good start. And then now I've got probably 100 college courses on disc across the room there, and maybe 20-25% of them have to do with science and math. I still can't do math, but I find science fascinating. There's an item in the Gannett papers this morning about how our galaxy ate another galaxy.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I find that stuff really cool.
Sure. Prior to that exploration of science, do you feel that your writing was more space opera then in terms of science fiction?
Well, no, I didn't think about it very much. One of the secrets of being a professional writer of the kind that I am is don't burden yourself with being an author, or don't carry into the job a lot of expectations. If I can get an editor to say, we need this by the 25th, it has to be 75,000 words, and that gives me some problems to solve. Okay, I know I can solve problems. I don't operate the way my son does. He is very scrupulous about getting every syllable right. I'm not. I think it's a job, and if I start thinking about, I'm competing with Alfred Bester here. I'm competing with Isaac Asimov. I'll be paralyzed. I'm not as good as those people. I never will be or never was. So if I think about it the way I used to think about newspaper work, the press thing, he's going to press the red button at 10 o'clock. My story has to be on there, on the press.
Yep.
That I can handle. When I have a book to write, I do simple long division. I can do that much math. Beyond that, I'm lost. But if I have 100 days to do this, and it has to be 100,000 words, that's how long I've got. That's how much I have to do every day. In the first hardcover, I was in a bad car crash in the middle of writing it. This was Batman Retires, the first really major continuity we did. Nightfall, it was called. And I had to kind of alter my method for 3 weeks. I couldn't write or do any work, but we made it. Wow. Charlie Kotzman and I spent the last weekend sitting in my bedroom in Brooklyn, going over the manuscript and editing it there and then. It had to be on the presses by noon Monday. This was Friday. Charlie and I spent the weekend editing that book, and we made the deadline. Charlie gets huge thanks. He was one of the best editors I've ever had. And the book, given all the handicaps that there were in getting the thing done, one of which was we knew we were going to do this novelization, and I didn't know that there was going to be any BBC adaptation, but I knew that there would be comic books and other stuff. And the deadline would be non-negotiable. So, but I said, I'm writing 2 or 3 comic books a month. I'm editing a franchise that are only 24 hours in the day. I can't manage this. There just isn't enough time. And Mary Fran said, if you let somebody else do this, you'll never forgive yourself. And I said, well, when you put it like that, you're absolutely right. So every Saturday morning, Mary Fran and I would get in the car and go out to the end of Brooklyn to a shopping mall, meet Charlie Kotzman. I would give him the work I had done in the past 6 days. He edited as he went along, and then, as I said, we did the final rewrites and edits really under the gun. Mary Fran bringing in cookies and coffee every 5 or 6 hours. And we got through it. I am delighted that I had that experience. And I never want to do anything like that again. I bought a computer. I bought a laptop computer. I hadn't used any computers up to that point. But driving to St. Louis, we both got sleepy. Mary Fran and I, after lunch, I had been driving, and I told her, "You've got to do this. I can't keep my eyes open." She said, "I can't either. I'll tell you what, you drive for the first hour, and then I'll take it." We hit a wall doing 70 in the middle of that hour. So we spent Christmas Day in an intensive care ward in a little mountain town in Pennsylvania.
Jesus.
And understand, I had the book about 40% done. The car, I'm told by people who saw the accident, flipped over 3 times, and the computer was loose in the back seat. So we got put into an intensive care ward, and the doctor asked what he could do for me, and I said, go out to wherever what's left of the car is and get my computer. Wow. The computer was fine, no glitches. I should have written Apple a thank you letter because... did that as a hardcover, and we knew it was going to be a big deal. In fact, we sort of set out to do a big deal Batman project. What I didn't know was that over across the corridor, Mike Carlin was doing something very similar with Superman. Same thing. He dies, comes back.
Yeah.
So I eventually went to Paul and said, why didn't you tell me that Mike was doing this? Because we have two stories going at the same time. We're getting 1 year's benefit out of this. We could have gotten 2 years. And he said, no, I did that deliberately because we want to tell the fans, hey, look at these scenes. Stuff is really happening over there, all over the place.
Yeah.
I don't know if he was right or wrong, but he did have, as always with Paul, he has reasons. And they're generally good ones.
It piqued my interest. I mean, I was certainly reading both stories. And that's interesting because I thought that Nightfall almost was inspired by the Superman Doomsday and Death of Superman story. So that's interesting in that typical way that sometimes it's just it's in the atmosphere. And you guys independently were both thinking along the same lines. That's pretty interesting. And I don't think a lot of people knew that. Pretty amazing.
No, I'm sure that a lot of people thought as you did, but I was following in Mike's footsteps. And if you know how publishing worked, it wasn't possible for me to follow in his footsteps because we had the same lead time. We had the same deadline.
Sure. Wow. Nightfall really was, I think, a terrific story. And was it in response to the things that were happening at Image and those more extreme superheroes that, you know, those guys that left Marvel were doing on their own?
No, I knew about those guys. Image sent their whole company up to drop in on DC and make a visit. And at least I think some of my colleagues thought, well, they're, coming to make peace with us. And that they were telling us they were going into competition with us, which they did very successfully for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened with us is, I guess my primary concern was always storytelling, and I realized that I had the freedom to do a 2,000-word story with a character who it has been estimated would be recognized by 80% of the people on the planet. And I thought, this is a rare gift they are giving me as a storyteller. I can actually do this. I don't know if we can bring it off, but I know that nobody will stop me from trying. So we had done the Robin Dies story, and I thought that sends a message to the readers, the loyal readers, that we are not above killing Batman. So we were at a retreat very close to where I'm sitting. I didn't know about Nyack, but it's across the river from Terrytown. And we realized if we're going to make the world think that Batman is dead, there's a pretty big step to take. I better get permission. So either one of my assistants or I called New York every 90 minutes or so and explained what we were going to do and said, it's not too late. We've plotted the next 6 months, but it's not too late to change. If there's going to be any problem with this, tell me. And I got all the go-aheads I needed, so cut to 3 months later, and we're into the story, and I'm crossing a lobby from the building, at the building where DC had its headquarters, and I run into an executive who tells me I have to bring Batman back to life. And I tried to explain, look, if nobody reads any Batman this year and they pick it up in a year, they won't know that anything has happened. We're going to put all the pieces back where you would like them to be. Didn't make any difference, so I had to compromise our story by inventing that subplot where Batman disguises himself as a British detective. As a writer, it gave me a challenge. Can I do British, a convincing British accent?
Okay.
In cold print. That compromised the story pretty badly. And my guess, based only on experience with that world, is that the people we were calling during the retreat did not bother to ask their superiors if it was okay to do this. So for the guys in the real big offices, this was a bad shock to them. Batman's dead. Batman is worth billions.
Well, yeah, this is in the midst of the movies, obviously, and I'm sure things were. I mean, sales certainly hadn't dropped as I understood it, or maybe they did. I don't know. So, what was your? No. Do you mind revealing what your original story plan was? Were you planning to, after killing Batman, revive him, or did you want him to stay dead and have John Paul Valley or Dick Grayson, someone else, taking over the mantle?
Well, we live in the real world, and I knew I would not get away with permanently killing Batman. But I thought I could get away with having him off stage for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really what we were going to do. Batman goes off. I hadn't plotted it that far. One of the basic disagreements I had with my crew was they wanted to plot every beat at the retreats, and I wanted to know what the big events for the next 6 months are, and let's give our writers some elbow room to come up with better ideas. So we were going to bring Bruce Wayne back, probably more or less as he was brought back eventually, though one of my freelance writers had some uncharitable things to say about curing somebody by laying on the hands. It's since been done on television series. But I was going to replace Batman with Jean Paul Valley for a year and then maybe kill off Azrael and everything would be as it was. Almost when we were almost at the end, they asked me to do Azrael as a hero and as a monthly book. Well, again, it was, if I let somebody else do this, I'll never forgive myself. But he was conceived as a villain,
right?
So I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about the series. I think maybe the middle run, the middle third, was pretty weak, and the rest of it was probably okay. I never read published material, and that's not an exception. They did do another Azrael series and neglected to pay me for that, and I decided not to make a fuss about that.
Wow.
But
yeah, that's
they are now obligated to pay us for ancillary use of stuff we've created, which is a huge step forward from, say, 10 years ago.
That's great to hear, and I know you mentioned that last time, like they're using Leslie Thompkins in Gotham, and I'm glad that you're being compensated for that. I just talked to Jerry Ordway, and he was telling me about how Supergirl was using Cat Grant, and that he was being compensated. So no, that's great to hear. And God, I mean, geez, man, the additions to the Batman house, if you put it in architecture terms, that you made over these decades and stuff, absolutely, man. I hope you're getting paid, and I'm glad to hear that it has gotten better. And I understand that as you told me in our last conversation, that Howard Chaykin's lawyer has been pretty instrumental in kind of making all that stuff happen. Am I correct?
Yeah, he's a very good man, and a very nice man, and a very good lawyer.
Good.
When the need for a lawyer arose in my life, I had the indispensable Larry call around. I said, see if you can find me who the best lawyer for comic books is. And he came up with Harris Miller, who was amazingly cooperative and very generous. He could have charged me 2 or 3 times what he did. So, yeah, Harris, I've had occasion to call him once or twice since. Well, in the novel, the hero of the novel was originally Captain Power.
Yes.
And I had Harris look up Captain Power, and he said, well, there are 3 Captain Powers who are actually under copyright. Probably nobody will make a fuss, but they could if they wanted to. So that's why we changed it. But Harris he just did that as a favor to me. Well,
that's
yeah,
cool.
I can find that out.
That's excellent. Yeah, man. Very cool.
The really good news happened when we went to see Batman versus Superman. And we looked at that. When I heard that they were making that, I thought, are they aware of what they've let themselves in for? These characters have never belonged in the same universe. It's an accident of publishing history that they are yoked. But it's not a good idea because one guy juggles sons and one guy can bench press probably 500 pounds and swim real fast and stuff. But they're not the same kind of character. The mythology is real different. But we saw at the beginning credits of that movie, Batman co-created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. So when we got home, I know Bill Finger's granddaughter a little bit. I've been on panels with her, and I had her phone number. So Mary Fran called her when we got home and said, how did you... Denny never was able to put your grandfather's name on anything that had to do with Batman. Was this a one-time only thing? And Althea said, no, we actually finally won a lawsuit. And from now on, the name Bill Finger will be, anytime you see the name Batman, you'll see Bill Finger. Bob Kane's name is still on it, and he had virtually nothing to do with the character as we know it. Mm-hmm. But at least Althea, Bill died, I'm told, broke and probably drinking too much. But my one evening with him was very drunk.
Wow.
But Althea, at least his granddaughter, will live comfortably. When I went out to visit the set, one of the Time Warner executives told me that every time we do a Batman movie, I write a 7-figure check for Bob Kane.
Wow.
So, like in the mid-50s, being paid for Batman probably didn't amount to much, but those movies have made billions with a B, of course. And little surprise, little bonus, they're good movies.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of them. Certainly most of them.
Well, the last 30, I don't count Joel Schumacher's contribution.
Understood. I think a lot of fans agree with you on that.
Well, apparently Joel agrees.
Yeah, I heard him on Fresh Air, the NPR interview show. And he talked about having to create scenes. They would bring him a toy prototype and say, we need a scene like this in Batman and Robin. And I think that kind of obviously contributed to the goofiness of the Clooney movie. Certainly, the Kilmer movie also a little, not as great as the two that Tim Burton did. But I thought Val Kilmer did okay, in spite of a lot of the zaniness. And you've got Jim Carrey as the Riddler. And man, what a waste of Tommy Lee Jones. Wouldn't it have been interesting? I'm sure you agree, to see him really get into the two faces, literally, of Harvey Dent. And they
apparently he was directed to play Two-Face like the Joker.
Wow.
I mean, he played him campy.
Yeah. And they really barely got into that wonderful backstory of Harvey Dent, the district attorney that worked with Batman. And I even very quickly, there was like a moment of clarity where Tommy Lee Jones is like, "You're right, Bruce." He tries to appeal to Harvey, and for a second, Harvey's sane and talking to him, and it's like, oh, there's that relationship. But that was like 20 seconds, and like I said, a missed opportunity. So,
and then the George Clooney one, the best part of the script, which I thought was at best mediocre, but it was a subplot which explains. It gives Bruce Wayne an out. He's been blaming himself for his parents' death. And he gets a piece of information, and he's not responsible for it. He thought that he made his parents go to the theater that night, and it turns out that they delayed their theater sojourn for 24 hours, so it wasn't his fault at all. I might quarrel with that as a Batman storyteller, because I always thought that the symbolic avenging of the Wayne's death was part of the essence of the character. Nonetheless, that was a very well-written subplot that answered questions, and they just cut it.
Interesting.
They left a couple of lines in that don't make any sense without a context to put them in. But that is the movie biz.
I hear you, man. I wonder, I just, and not to name drop, but for context, a couple months ago, I had a dinner with Mark Miller, and we were talking about Superman, and the question of, is Superman Kal-El of Krypton, or is he Clark Kent that learns he's Kal-El of Krypton and grows up with the Earth values? And, Clark is the man, Superman is the guys. And Mark's disagreement was, no, he is, so smart being a Kryptonian that it's almost like being raised by a colony of ants in terms of the intellectual difference of a Kryptonian and an Earthman. And I wondered regarding, I'm sure you've been hit with this question before, is Batman the real man? Is Bruce Wayne a guise, or is this a traumatized Bruce Wayne that, is still, at the end of the day, a guy trying to do good? But, what is your thought on the Batman versus Bruce Wayne guys?
I think Bruce Wayne died with his parents, mom and dad. Okay. And from then on, Bruce allowed that tragedy to shape the life decisions he made. So in my mind, I never got from any writer except myself the kind of Bruce Wayne I wanted. There has been, particularly with the movies, a tendency to make Bruce Wayne, this very smart, ruthless tycoon guy. I think he should have been, I had a real-life person that owned a magazine I freelanced for. Huh. A guy who was really a nice man, inherited a vast fortune, and kind of blew it by never being able to get his act together. My Bruce Wayne would be driving a Ferrari, but he'd have a dent in the front fender because he backed it into he hit something the first time he took it out. And he was totally dependent on his assistants, as I occasionally was, to get things done. Love life, I didn't think there would have been any room for a relationship. So in my private version. Gotham City is full of debutantes who had one date with Bruce Wayne and said, "Oh, he got a headache. He took me home at 10 o'clock. He just wasn't feeling well." I couldn't see him as a lover, and the information I just got that he's making it with Catwoman. Well, the dynamic with Ra's al Ghul was he could never get it on with Talia, though clearly they were the only two people on the planet who were ideal for each other. But she had a daddy hang-up, and he had a criminal hang-up, and she was a criminal, so he could never do that. I thought that added attention to the continuity that, helped the story along.
I understand. And what did you think when, there's a couple times when Steve Englehart created Silver St. Cloud, and we had the Laughing Fish story. Were you editing then, or were you also...
No, I was a freelancer.
Okay, yeah, you guys were both writers of Batman. Okay, so... And
Steve convinced the powers that be that, he was a hot writer. I never paid attention to things like who's hot, or there was a kind of pecking order. If you were the guy who wrote Superman, you were higher on the pecking order than if you were the guy that wrote Power Man. But those things weren't part of some people's experience, and when I finally took over editing the franchise, I simply ignored Silver St. Cloud. I thought it was a bad idea. I didn't think that Batman would fall in love with a debutante. So we didn't have to write her out. We could just ignore her. It was the same way with Batman's child in that graphic novel that Mike Barr did.
Son of the Demon.
I thought that was I thought that was a terrible idea in terms of Batman storytelling. But I didn't have to write it out. I explained to Mike, and we took a long walk around the lake in Hollywood, that I was not going to ever refer to that, and this is nothing against you, Mike. It's, in my editorial opinion, it's not a good storytelling trope. I don't think Mike has ever forgiven me for that, but they have brought those characters back, and that's now an official part of the continuity.
That's right. Yeah, Damian's part of the story now.
And you have to remember that there is no right or wrong in this
Oh,
stuff.
Sure. Absolutely, man. Yeah.
That was my opinion of how the story and the mythos should play out. Doesn't mean I was right or wrong. It was my opinion, and it was working.
I understand. Absolutely, man. You're known for some of your guidelines, if not rules, for writing Batman. And I know one of them, and I imagine it might dovetail into what you were saying earlier about Superman. And I want to explore that for a second. But one thing I know that you said was you didn't like Batman in space, and that you would kind of, shy away from those stories and stuff as much as you could. Sometimes there was a big event, and I suppose, they expected the Batman comics to dovetail into an event. But it seemed, again, I only get my information from the fan magazines of the day, but it sounded like you weren't crazy about the idea of putting Batman in space.
I thought it was a terrible idea, in the same way it was a terrible idea for Eisner to put the Spirit in space. They're not that kind of character. The mythos, the mythic underpinnings. For Batman, it's more Dracula than Percival or any of the King Arthur's men.
Okay.
I don't think those guys were thinking about this stuff with the left side of their brains, but in a way, Batman is brilliant because we are fascinated by darkness and evil. Villains are almost always more interesting than heroes. Well, here you have that iconography of the dark, and in every culture that I know about, except Chinese, bats are symbols of evil, or reincarnated souls, or stuff like that. So you have that iconography, but he's on our side. He's a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
So you had your cake and eat it. Putting him in space makes it what I think of as science fiction light, just not appropriate for the character as we were doing him then. It doesn't mean that somebody will come along and write a terrific Batman in space story.
Sure.
If it's happened, I haven't seen it.
Well, and how often, again, based on what you said about the Batman Superman ideas, that they were kind of conflicting universes in the same publishing house, how often did Superman show up in your Batman stories, if ever?
Only when there was a crossover. And I never resisted participating in the crossovers because that was going in. It's not your ball and it's not your bat, and your daddy doesn't own the park.
Sure.
Something that is like that, we had to participate in it. I was always able to contrive it so that Batman occupied a little distant corner of the story and could do Batman-like things and did not have to deal with ray guns and spaceships and aliens. The Batman as a storytelling tool was flexible enough that we could get away with cheating like that once in a while, as long as I didn't have to do it every month.
Understood. And again, like, what about the interpersonal relationship with Superman? How did you tackle it when it necessitated a conversation between Clark and Bruce?
I didn't ever write that scene. I don't remember. Well, Miller kind of answered that.
Sure.
If I'm remembering my continuity, Superman gives Batman a piece of kryptonite and says, if I ever go off the deep end, use this. I thought that was a good way to nod toward established continuity and still do it with a logical story point.
I think that was John. So, I think that was John Byrne in Man of Steel.
Was that Byrne?
Yeah, and I also wonder, as John Byrne came in, that period, because obviously you had Frank writing Batman Year One, and certainly before it, The Dark Knight Returns. That was such a great evolution of the character. And in the meantime, Byrne was doing his thing with Man of Steel, and obviously rebooting Superman and kind of changing things around, stripping away a lot of that Mort Weisinger era and even Julie Schwartz era, obviously. So how did when there was this newer Superman, did the character change at all for you from an editorial standpoint or a writing standpoint?
Yeah, excuse me. Water.
Oh yeah, by all means, yeah, Denny. And by the way, we've already gone an hour. Like, am I taxing you? I don't want to.
No, you're not. I have nothing to do until tomorrow at 2. So.
Well, I'm enjoying the conversation, so please continue.
But yeah, I resisted being involved with Superman when that first arose. And my problem was basically what we do is fantasy melodrama. The essence of melodrama is conflict. You have to have a worthy opponent for your hero. To have Superman go after pickpockets would be ludicrous. Well, how do you keep contriving a problem for Superman to solve? I mean, I did the Justice League for about a year and a half.
Absolutely.
And that's where that problem arose. When I did my 4th or 5th alien invasion, I realized my creative tank is empty as far as this character is concerned. Later writers did a much better job than I did of making it make sense and getting good stories out of it. But yeah, they to my mind, they did not belong in the same story. And if you have Superman, it depends on which era, but at his most powerful, he was God. He was juggling suns. He was able to search every room in Metropolis in a second or so. Then how do you put that character in a believable conflict? He can do anything. So why doesn't he solve whatever problem it is in the second panel? You had to contrive answers to that if you were going to be consistent with the character. Back in the 40s when they were creating this stuff, they didn't worry about that. And they shouldn't have. I mean, it was not part of the problem they had to solve. A lot of them, well, Jerry, you mentioned Jerry before, who became a pretty close friend of mine toward the end of his life.
Jerry Siegel.
Great guy. And he did occasional script changes when he was, a very young guy doing comics. But that was okay because nobody knew how to write comic books back then. And the mistake I most often ran into when I was teaching was people ask things of the artist they can't deliver. So Jerry had a natural gift as a storyteller. He was a very good artist. And if some writer who had never written a comic book before asked for something that couldn't be accommodated in that very limited and artificial storytelling tool that was the comic book, Jerry could change it. I think that I've been rewritten a few times. I deeply, deeply resent it. It's one of the reasons I don't read published work, and I made one horrible life mistake this within the past year. I watched myself on television. I watched the public. I don't normally do that because I don't like the way I look. But I watched the public television thing,
yes,
and that was a terrible mistake on my part because it was apparently I didn't have much to do with Green Lantern and Green Arrow. Apparently the artist wanted to draw a Green Lantern, so he got Julie Schwartz to. And then Denny wrote a script.
Wow.
No, Denny wrote the script a long time before the artist was involved. Denny thought the script was going to be done by Gil Kane. But it's nothing to get lathery about, but it is annoying.
Well, let's set the record straight. Let's talk about that Green Lantern, Green Arrow run, because I was thinking about how Siegel and Schuster very early on in Superman really had Superman attacking social justice issues, and I know there was a very early issue where it cleaned out a slum and really kind of improved it. And,
went after an evil mine owner, a capitalist.
Yes, and of course, the famous radio story of him going after the Klan and things like that. So,
and also on the radio an anti-Semitic story.
Yes, very much so. Yes. So yeah, tell me, was the first Green Lantern, Green Arrow story about where that classic scene happens where the elderly black gentleman says, "Hey, you save the orange skins, you save the purple skins. What are you doing for the black skins here on Earth?"
No, that way Neil did not only serve the script, but I thought that's among the three best panels ever in the history of comics. And one of the things that absolutely delights me is my favorite politician, who turns out to be a huge comics fan, and the only person I know who ever read all of Philip K. Dick. He used that as a campaign thing. He rewrote the dialogue.
Wow, cool.
That guy's name is Alan Grayson. He is a Democratic congressman currently up for re-election from Florida. And I got this, Mary took a phone call and she said there's this congressman who wants to know if he can buy a coffee or a drink or something. And I thought, well, okay, he probably wants my help because he's going to do a campaign comic book. So I arranged to meet the guy, and no, we didn't talk about politics. We talked about comic books. I gave him a 5-minute crash course in visual narrative and in static images. And then he told me, we got on Philip K. Dick, and he told me that he had read all of Philip K. Dick's exegesis. I think that's something like 5,000 pages. I don't know anybody else who even tried to do that.
Very cool. I'm looking him up. I want to make sure. I think I know Alan Grayson. I think he's made himself known at times.
Well, he doesn't take corporate money. He's the real deal, as far as I can tell.
Yes, I'm looking.
I don't think it's possible to be a major politician and remain uncorrupted. But he's been on my radar for a few years now, and I get 2 or 3 emails from him in a week. He looks like the real deal. As I said, he grew up in the Bronx. He was a street kid.
Well, he seems to have been a strong, as I remember seeing video clips of him, I know he was a strong proponent for, better health care, and certainly was complaining about the Republicans' answer. And I remember a famous quote of his of, the Republican solution is you get sick, you don't get health care, and you die. And that's how they solve the health care issue. So, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. And isn't it always great when you learn various people who are comic book people? And I certainly get a kick out of it when I hear not only celebrities, but also, again, Brad Meltzer, I forget which specific politician had Green Arrow in his office. And as he was getting started with his Green Arrow run, referred to, I believe he was a governor. And it certainly wasn't Jeb Bush. That's his local governor down in Florida. But no, that's great. And I wanted to know. So when you suggested these stories to Julie Schwartz, I'm assuming, and you guys were kind of putting more social justice in these stories, was there a concern? Was there like, hey, we don't want to, we're telling stories for 12-year-olds. Why, what are you doing putting these kinds of issues in stories?
I wondered the same thing. So I talked to Julie a lot for the last year of his life. I talked to him every Thursday morning. I was going in to teach a class, and he was coming in and would walk up and down the halls and stick his head in open doors and say, "What are you doing?" to editors. So I don't think Julie bothered to ask permission. I once asked him, well, the conventional wisdom in the 40s and 50s was you can't have continued stories because the newsstand distribution was so erratic that because I got Detective Party 5, that doesn't mean I will be able to get Detective Party 6.
Yes.
And yet he did a continued story once a year. And I said, how did you get away with that? And he said, I didn't ask. But nobody ever said anything. I think with Green Lantern and Green Arrow, he didn't see any need to share what we were doing with anyone. And so, the genesis of that was my paying my weekly visit to D.C., and I do a terrible Julie Schwartz little, well, my boy, what have you got? And it was a very avuncular editor. And I had done a couple of things, one of them for him with social concerns near the center of the story. And I wanted to do more. I was genuinely concerned with what was going on in the world. So he said that they wanted to, he personally, I think, wanted to continue publishing Green Lantern. The science fiction elements of it must have appealed to him.
Sure.
But the sales did not justify continued publication. So he pretty much gave me a blank slate. I told him an idea or two I had, and then I went home and wrote the story. And then I wrote another one and another one. And at that point, the first one was on the newsstand, and we got noticed by reporters. The first story that appeared was in the Village Voice, a counterculture newspaper from Greenwich Village that was on my must-reading list.
I hear you. Me too.
Yeah, it was founded by Norman Mailer in a bar I used to frequent. Anyway, I think that somebody at The Voice saw this and thought there might be a story there and called the number that was in the telephone book for DC Comics. Maybe got a receptionist or an assistant editor, somebody who didn't know what we were doing, because Julie wasn't mentioned in the Village Voice piece, nor was I, nor was Neil. And I think they didn't know what they were doing. That changed rapidly and drastically, and I found myself being interviewed by Parisian television. That was an experience not many people had.
Wow.
And we got invited to universities, and we were suddenly respectable. But I think that came as a surprise to the people in the big office, because comic books, we don't have. I doubt that they read it. One of the real pluses in the Paul Levitt column is he did read this stuff, and he had opinions about it. But I don't think any of the executives bothered. And so this came as a surprise to them, but it came as a surprise that it came with an endorsement from the mayor of New York City, among other people. So they saw a bandwagon they could hop on, and that mayor eventually wrote a text piece for us. He was the last liberal Republican mayor.
Was that
in the United States?
Was that John Lindsay?
Lindsay, yeah.
John Lindsay, yeah. No, I remember.
Yeah.
And I've certainly seen my share of video of Mayor Lindsay and everything. And of course, kind of Batman television fans might know that there was a parody of him in the television show as well. Mayor Linseed, I believe, was how he was called. But you kind of, if you knew your history of politics, you knew who they were talking about back then. That's cool. And also, I remember your amazing issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow, where clearly, as at least from an artist standpoint, it was Spiro Agnew in the story, and there was a little girl that had a face very much like Richard Nixon's face.
Yeah, and therein though lies another sore point. Because I didn't know that cover was going to be done. The problem with it was that had nothing to do with the story. It had nothing to do with the continuity. You could certainly attack Agnew and Nixon, though at least one of my freelancers who's a conservative said he found it offensive.
Interesting.
But at the time, I thought it was so obvious that these guys are crooks and corrupt, there won't be any problem with this. Well, there are people who think that Nixon was a great president.
Yeah.
But I resented that because what did it have to do with anything? It didn't make any political comment of its own, and it had nothing to do with the story.
Interesting.
Occasionally, Julie would let things get by that I couldn't understand why he did. That was an example. I don't know that I would have okayed that cover had I been editing the thing at the time.
Understood. No, I understand. I did want to ask you how you initially got the Batman writing job. And I don't know if we've ever talked about that. And I'm sure you've told the story a million times, but if you don't mind, I'd love to hear it.
No, I don't mind. I was working for Smile and Stanley as an editorial assistant, and then he fired me on what was probably the worst day of my life. I had a small baby, you know, a child who was still being breastfed, and no money, and it was in the middle of a newspaper strike where my saleable skills were good on the market. And New York City, we didn't have any relatives, we didn't have any support system, and I didn't have any savings, and suddenly, 10 o'clock of a weekday morning, I'm without a job. So I had socialized in the comic book world by then, and Steve Skates knew about Charlton Comics.
Yes.
And Dick Giordano came in once a week and sat in an office on Fifth Avenue that they rented. Empty room, really, with a desk and a couple of chairs, and he talked to the local freelancers. So I went up and I saw him on one of those days, and he gave me a job that I did pretty well. And then I did my first socially conscious story for him. It was called Children of Doom, and it was a pacifist-oriented story.
Jim Aparo drew that, am I right?
No, it was...
I thought he did.
It was a strange... I can't think of the guy's name. His day job was a cop.
Oh, Joe... Pete Morrissey.
Pete Morrissey, yeah. It was a hurry-up job. It had to be done in 4 days.
Oh, man. You know, I love...
So, and Dick called me. He had something scheduled for that, and the rights to what they were going to publish fell through. I don't have any particulars. But he suddenly had a big hole in his schedule, and he needed something in a week, and it didn't make any difference what it was. So he called me and said, you know, can you have me a script by Thursday? And I said, yeah, I guess. So I wrote that because it's what I wanted to write. And it went to artists who were also under terrible time pressure, but I think that worked for the work they did. I think the story came off well because nobody had time to have any second thoughts about anything. There is something to be said for deadlines, and that's part of it right there. You don't have time to, you know, stick your head up your ass and worry about things.
Agreed. Well, and I got it for a second as a tangent. I am fascinated by Pete Morrissey's work, both as a writer and an artist, because he was cranking out, it seemed like 75% of Charlton's output. And like you said, by day he was a cop, and by night he was writing these stories and drawing these stories. And I loved Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, and I want to say Vengeance Squad was one of his throwaway Charlton things that, you know, managed to, you know, they cranked out maybe 6 issues. And just the whole, I mean, God, we could spend 2 hours just talking about Charlton and the powers that be in Derby, Connecticut, and why the comics were made and what their main business was. But that we'll do that another day. But so go on. So you're doing this sci-fi story for Charlton. So then for Dick,
and I'm doing a lot of stuff for Dick, and I was a model of reliability. I did not blow a deadline. Much later, Dick and I socially talked about that, and I was always afraid if I blow this deadline, I will never get another job from this editor, and maybe not from this genre. And Dick said he had the same problem. He was afraid to miss deadlines, so he never did. He got up at 5, worked till 8, and then took a train in to be an editor-in-chief. Anyway, after about a year of that, I walked in there one day and Dick said, how would you like to do exactly what you're doing now at 3 times the money? Okay, that was a very persuasive argument for a guy who had, at that time, Larry was maybe a year and a half old, and we were living in a ghetto, and Anne did not have saleable skills. She was a philosophy major. I'm very proud of her now because she's become an environmental activist.
Oh, wow.
But at the time, sure. And what had happened was Dick had been hired by DC, and part of the deal was he could bring some of his Charlton people with him. One of those was Steve Ditko. Skates and myself were the two writers. And so, yeah, suddenly I was getting $12 a page instead of $4 a page. Years and years later, I got the whole story that I didn't know at the time, and thank God. But I was writing a text piece for Superman's 50th anniversary for a hardcover publisher in the Midwest. And one of the people I interviewed was Paul Levitz, who told me how I came to work for DC Comics. I don't know what Steve was thinking about, and I haven't seen him in years. But I was thinking, well, these people at DC saw the great work that we're doing for Charlton and decided that they would bring us aboard. No, that wasn't even close to what happened. What happened was the guys who created comic books, Gary Robinson was one of them, and, that bunch of names that you occasionally saw in the comics. It was after the war. Most of them had been veterans. They were solid citizens. They had families. They had mortgages. They were eminently decent citizens. And they asked the company for a little help with health insurance. They weren't threatening job actions or anything, just hat in hand kind, can we please have some help with this? The company's response was to fire them. All.
Yeah.
And Skates and I were warm bodies. We could type. That's all they knew about or cared about. So when Paul told me that story, I said, "You realize I'm interviewing you in a role as a journalist, and you just told me something that makes the company look really bad." And he said, "No, put it in print because it'll tell everybody how far we've come."
Wow.
Well, we've come much further than that since I wrote that piece. But I came to work for DC not because of any virtue I had as either a professional or as a writer, because I needed warm bodies.
Wow.
It was as simple as that.
Jeez. And I know,
That was the comic book business then, and to some degree that was the TV business. Writers were going to get screwed.
Yeah. Jeez. Yeah, and
and we never did what TV and movie people did, was put together a really good union. I still get mailings from them, and I've been a member emeritus for about 10 years. But anytime anything of mine is shown at 3 a.m. in Addis Ababa, they will see that I get whatever money is coming.
That's great, man. No, I understand the Writers Guild, and certainly about 10 years ago when the idea of Netflix and streaming TV was just getting started, and even the DVD re-releases of television and film, I'm glad the Writers Guild was able to step up and, get better compensation. I don't know if, as usual with a union and bosses compromise, nobody gets everything they really want. But I'm assuming that it's gotten better, and certainly, you know better, I think.
Well, Roy and Jerry have a story to tell, which pretty much illustrates what you've been saying. They wrote the last Conan movie, and they took it in, and they pitched their story to Dino De Laurentiis, and he allowed us how, that was a good Conan story. They would get the job. What he did was give it to a writer he had under contract. That guy did the actual shooting script using Jerry and Roy's story, and Jerry and Roy got nothing.
Wow.
And the other guy's name went on. That was very common. It was even done in comic books. In the Superman office, didn't have any first-hand experience with it, but you heard stories. And that editor was Jim Shooter's mentor, which I find interesting. But
was that more Weisinger? Forgive me for putting a name on it.
Yeah, I would rather not use proper names, but yeah.
Okay, all right. I understand.
And he wasn't the only one. There was one guy who, at Christmas time, gave to all of his freelancers copies of his suit and shirt and shoe and necktie preferences. So the idea was, you're going to give me an expensive Christmas gift.
Wow. Oh, my God.
Whatever Jim Shooter's problems were with him, it was exactly the opposite. He gave us nice gifts.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Now, we mentioned a couple names, and actually, while we're talking about him, when you went to Marvel, what was that? What was the impetus for you leaving DC and going to Marvel?
I was writing a book on the history of comics for Scholastic Press, and I interviewed everybody I could think of to interview. One of them was Jim Shooter, who was brand new at that job, and he offered me, a job. Now, at that point, I was writing a lot, and I thought I was up to my capacity. I couldn't do any more without compromising the work. I don't know if that was true or not. We'll never know. But I was looking for some way to earn a living that did not depend on talent, but on, thinking about things. Obviously, editorial work was that. I went to my bosses at DC and presented them with the problem. I got a kid who's starting school. I have expenses I didn't used to have. Their answer was to give me more writing work. Jim Shooter's answer was to give me a writer-editor deal and a raise. So, of course, with apologies to DC, I took the offer. And for 2 years, he was the best boss I ever had. And I also had as an assistant Mark Grunwald.
Oh, wow. Sure.
Who was an enormous benefit to the comic book world.
Amen. Absolutely, man. Great writer. Absolutely.
He's gone 20 years now.
Wow.
Hard to believe.
I know. Jeez, man. Oof. So, you said, all right, so were you only at Marvel for those 2 years, or did things change? Did Jim leave and then you had other...
No, I stayed. I think I worked as a Marvel editor for 7 years.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense.
Toward the end, though, things were getting very uncomfortable, and I sensed that Shooter was not happy with me, and I didn't know why. The frustrating part was the thing I worked at hardest was figuring out ways to please him. So I would occasionally go to his office after hours, and I'd say, I think you're unhappy with me. What can I do? Finally, Dick made his offer, and I kept stalling him. And then finally, I decided I'd be a fool not to accept Shooter's job. So I remember I went out running through Lower Manhattan that day. I was trying to run about 5 miles a day at the time. And I got back and there was a phone call. Anyway, I was hired by Shooter, who said that There Is No Hope in Crime Alley was one of the best comic book stories, and it was one of his favorites, and I was the writer. And after a year of writing Spider-Man, I got fired off that. I took over Iron Man. This is another thing I learned years later. Jim did not like my Iron Man.
Interesting.
It was getting praise from the world, but not from him. And he tried to get Mark to fire me. And Mark stood up for me and put his own job in jeopardy once a month by refusing to do that.
Wow.
And refusing to edit the stories to make them more what other people thought they ought to be. I did not have a whisper of any of that until Mike Carlin told me years later. He was Mark's assistant at the time.
Okay.
I got to know Mark really well after that, but he was he was a creative guy's editor. And eventually, I kept getting calls from Dick Giordano saying, "Why, have you decided to come to work for me yet?" And I was having a tough time with Jim, so I went to his boss and said, "I've been offered a job at DC, and right now I'm thinking of taking it. Would you like to react to that?" And he said, "Is the problem your boss?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, you and I and he will have," this was a Monday, "lunch on Thursday. I will make peace between you guys because we don't want to lose you." So Tuesday we had a day-long editorial conference. Wednesday I went into work and Shooter walked into my office at 10 and said, "We have to part company." He was firing me. I said, "Okay, what reason are you going to give the world for this action you're taking?" He said, "Well, we asked Byrne to change something, and it was Jim's idea, not mine, and I didn't take credit or blame for it. And in Jim's opinion, I should have." So I said, "Yeah, that's true. I didn't agree with the change, and I didn't tell John that it was mine." So I took leave, and then I called Dick and said, "I'm ready to go to work for him." He said, "Well, you waited too long. We hired somebody else."
Jesus.
So for 3 weeks, I was freelance.
Oh, my God.
That was Michael that they hired.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Then right after New Year's, right after the holidays, I got a call from Dick saying, "You start work on Monday afternoon, be here by 12, and welcome aboard."
Wow. Honestly, man, hearing these things, it's amazing. And again, I was reading the fan magazines back then, Amazing Heroes and Comics Interview and Comics Journal and everything. And yeah, those were our news sources. When you were doing your interviews for Scholastic, I'm curious, this opens a new question. Did you tape record them? Did you, I mean, obviously I know you're a journalist and I'm sure you're used to just doing an interview with a notepad, but how did you transcribe these interviews?
Oh, I was very conscientious, so I did tape record everything. I mean, the best job I had at that period as a magazine writer was interviewing Alfred Bester.
Wow.
It was the best afternoon I ever had working.
Yeah.
He was at a party. I was kind of social back then, and there was a party in Greenwich Village, and I was a kind of village guy, so I went, and that was Alfred Bester standing across the room. I can't go talk to him. He is a god. He is my favorite science fiction writer, so I didn't talk to him, but Roy gave me an assignment to interview him for their black and white SF magazine a week later. And he was living on like 60th and Madison. And he was everything you want a writer to be if you don't know any writers. Funny, kind, erudite, full of lots and lots of information. Yeah, come in. And, I had a couple of run-ins with him later, but that was just an absolutely flat-out wonderful afternoon. I don't know how I got off on that, but that was
Go on. Yeah.
I still like doing journalism because it was such a nice change from doing comics.
I understand.
So I didn't refuse any of those kind of jobs. I didn't refuse the offer to write a book for Scholastic.
Did you hang on to those tapes? Or did you, after it was done?
No, God knows where they went. I have moved about 14 times since then. And one of the reasons I'm not moving out of this house, although I'm now living here alone, is there are so goddamn many books and tapes and videos and courses and thousands of comic books.
Sure, I bet.
It's going to be a nightmare for whoever gets stuck doing that after I cash in my chips. If that's how I cash in my chips.
I understand.
I've been dead once, and
you were
nothing to it.
You were dead once, you say?
Yeah, about 15 years ago, I was having lunch with Mia Wolf. Probably you don't know the name. She has a connection to comics. But we were, and her 12-year-old son, Virgil, were in a Mexican restaurant in a nearby town. And according to Mia, I was talking about I don't believe in an afterlife. And she said that you fell off the chair. And I thought you were trying to be funny.
Oh, my God.
So I didn't do anything. And after a couple of minutes, I looked over and you had turned green. So she yelled for help. The guy who owned the restaurant was also a fireman. So he knew where there was a defibrillator next door in City Hall. He got that on the third try. He got my heart beating. I was clinically dead for 5 to 10 minutes, I guess.
Jesus.
Nobody was keeping track. And by that time, the medics had arrived, and they had great toys for bringing me back to life. So they did. And I went to hospitals and then had open heart surgery about a week later.
Wow. I do remember I remember when you were recovering from your heart surgery. Wow. Oh, my. Denny,
Yeah, now all 4 of my brothers have had the same operation. It's obviously genetics.
Jeez, man. Well, all these, near-death experiences that you've had, this is incredible. I'm glad you made it to the other, that you're able to walk away from them. I'm sure slowly, but I'm glad that, geez, I don't know what else to say. That's insane. And I'm sorry.
Well, I can say that on the plus side, I have not had a dull or boring life. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful for the last 15 years of being a comic book editor because, gee whiz, Mary Fran and I went to fucking Australia, for heaven's sake.
Fantastic.
I would never have even thought to go there. We got introduced to the president of Chile. We had lunch in the Senate dining room. It's been such an interesting life. BC, the Time Warner stayed out of my face except for that one story I told you where I had to bring Batman back to life prematurely.
Right.
But I worked with great people. I had the best toy you could give a storyteller. Batman is a great storytelling tool, and I could pretty much tell the stories I wanted to tell. It was a great gift to give to somebody whose primary mission in life has been telling stories. So yeah, it has been a tough life here and there, but I wouldn't change a second of it.
I understand.
Because, wow,
yeah.
What a great, and toward the end, there was money attached. When I went to work in comics, I was making enough to cover expenses, rent and food. Toward the end, we had royalties. We had ancillary payments. It got to be a very good job as jobs go. It was hard sometimes. There were bad weeks, bad months. But that's true of any job.
Sure.
I didn't work anywhere near as hard as my father did running a grocery store.
Understood. My dad ran a restaurant. I totally understand, and I feel the same way. And no, and again, that's great and not surprising because again, your body of work has been beloved for all these decades. And again, what you put into Batman in particular, yeah, I mean, again, they're all following in your footsteps, Denny, and I say that because it's true. And also I'm interested when you came back and also after you got sober, am I right in the time frame? You wrote Venom, the original Legends of the Dark Knight story that introduced the drug that later became the basis for Bane.
Yeah.
But that story of Bruce Wayne really kind of finding this way to at least initially think, oh my God, this is an improvement. I can be a better Batman through the help of chemicals. Tell me about that story and how.
Oh, I would not have written it if I hadn't had my own experience with alcoholism. But the genesis of the story was my waking up one day and realizing nobody ever takes the first drink thinking, well, I'm going to completely fuck up my life. I'm going to ruin my marriage. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to end up in a gutter. Yeah, that's my agenda. I couldn't talk to girls sober. I mean, alcohol allowed me to go to parties and ask girls for dates for a long time. It was a very useful social tool. Now, there comes the day when a corner is turned and suddenly it's not a tool anymore, it's something you have to have. Then you've got problems. And you never know. Annie, my wife, matched me drink for drink back then, but she didn't have to have it. When it was appropriate to stop drinking, she stopped. When it was appropriate to stop drinking, I continued until the bottle was empty. Yeah. So you never know ahead of time. Both sides of the family are riddled with bad alcoholics. I didn't know that. So one of the things I told my son early on was I did an 8th step with him. You're supposed to talk to the people who were harmed by your drinking and confess your sins to them. And I figured the two people most harmed were Jeannie Thomas and Larry ONeil, and I talked to both of them.
Wow.
And that's a good strategy. You face the demons. But the genesis of that story was exactly that. If I take this drug, whatever it is, I can be a better version of what I am. And it's true for a while, usually. Then comes the bad times.
No, it was an incredible story. It's really, I think, a very powerful one, and I love the evolution of this storytelling, and I wanted to know your opinion of this, if this was a conscious decision, because the prior decades to when you guys started being more socially aware, but also really getting into character, I really think obviously just elevated the whole comic book medium as far as the superhero genre goes, because now we were seeing the flaws in these characters. And, Dave Michelini did it with Iron Man, with Demon in a Bottle. Or
I owe Dave for that.
And that's, I mean, those kinds of moves. And certainly Venom is a great personal Bruce story where he had, I just think that's great rather than smash through the wall, like my Superman trope. And don't get me wrong, it still works. But that classic, like, George Reeves moment, he crashes through the wall, the gangsters shoot at him, bullets bounce off, he clunks their heads, and he flies them off to jail, and that's the end of the story, or the Batman equivalent. And it's like, no, you appreciate when they have doubts. Frank did it as well, Miller in Dark Knight Returns, and these characters become more three-dimensional. So was that one of your goals as you were writing comics, even going back to, those times in the 70s?
Well, here's the big advantage I had that my predecessors didn't. I went into it after Stan Lee created Marvel, and what he did to create Marvel as much as anything was to change the writing. Everybody was still in the shadow of Frederick Wertham, and comic book guys were afraid to even use slang. Stan pretty deliberately decided to ignore that stuff. He wrote witty, self-deprecating, self-satirical stories. I was, by that time, a Navy veteran, and I taught in ghetto schools, and I thought of myself as pretty sophisticated. But Stan's approach gave me permission. He's not taking it seriously, therefore I can read this because I won't take it seriously either. I think what I was really responding to was the stories. But my excuse was, well, he's got these witty captions that are making fun of the whole Marvel thing. So, yeah. So I had that going for me, that Stan had found a new way to approach the writing of comic book stories. And at about the same time, Julie Schwartz had reinvented the other half of it, the half that does with origin stories and plots. He called on his science fiction background. It served him well. And between the two of them, they reinvented superheroes within a year or so of each other. So I came in, as did Roy and Steve, without any need to pay a lot of attention to a lot of stupid rules that really didn't serve any purpose. And it was okay for me to do characters because Stan was doing characters. He had, opened the path. And it didn't occur to me not to write the stories as wittily as I could.
Well, that's good. I mean, again, it blew my little mind, as a 10-year-old something, and then into my tween years in the early 70s, and always really appreciated your writing, Carrie Bates' writing, Marty Pasco, and
Carrie was the great unsung hero. I mean, for 11 years, he found a new way to use super speed. That alone would put him in my pantheon.
Agreed. And I always loved his Superman stories too. I always felt he really had a great handle on telling great Superman stories, and Elliot Magan as well. And I know he's one of your disciples, and certainly followed your example with Green Arrow years after your guys' run. You guys were my original storytellers, and truly I followed your stuff very carefully and appreciated what you guys were doing, and felt like, again, I was reading important stories. When I read the 100-page spectaculars or 80-page giants, and they would have the reprints of the older stuff, I still appreciated those because I think I was young enough to still do it, and I'm glad I read those.
Well, yeah, they were what they were. It's been a long and fairly fast evolution from people who had done nothing but write pulp stories suddenly are doing comic books, and they don't. I think Jerry Schuster, Joe Siegel, and Bill Finger had a sense of what a comic book was, what this kind of narration was. But most of the guys were really making it up as they went along, and it wasn't supposed to be good. Because the bosses had no respect for, the work that was being done. They got real rich because of that work, but they didn't find any need to share any of that. Health insurance? No, you're fired.
Yeah. Jeez. How about Jeanette Kahn when she came over? Did you have many interactions?
Well, she was a breath of fresh air. She was her predecessor was a guy who was not, even though he would deny this now, was not a businessman, and he got the job as the big boss, I think because what became Time Warner bought the company, and they didn't know anything about it, but they had flow charts and that sort of thing. And on paper, he was the highest ranking member of the editorial department. So he kind of got the job, I think, that way. There's a lot of gossip that went around about the particulars of that. I'm not going to retail any of that because I have no reason to believe it's true.
Okay.
But he walked into his office one day and he was escorted out of the building by security guys. I have never found out why, but it was not just getting fired, because that happened fairly often, and it was not that unusual, but he was not allowed to take anything out of his office, as far as I know. I know for a certainty he was escorted onto the street by uniformed guys. And then here comes Jeanette Kahn, 23 years old. Rabbi's daughter had started 2 successful children's magazines already in her young life, and they gave her the job. And she learned on the job, but she was, well, the name of the company was National Periodicals Publications. And as Tom Wolfe once said about the New York Times Magazine, you think water buffaloes on the cover and dull stories and your weekly dose of boredom. And along comes Jeanette and says, we shouldn't hide the fact that we do comics. We should advertise it. So she had a jacket made for herself. At that time, Superman, the movie, was in the air. Jeanette's jacket said Superman, the comic book, on the back of it. And I think she made mistakes, as anybody would, coming into a totally alien job. But she made us happy with what we did. She tried to give us a sense of pride. She tried to bring this antiquated publishing venue into the 20th century. I think she was much more on the plus side than on the minus side. I think she now lives just a few blocks from my kid. My kid just moved to Harlem. And Jeanette has lived there about 10 years now.
That's awesome. I'm really glad. It seems like in the last couple of years, people are learning more about her story and that she is getting her due for changing things. And I'll tell you, man, again, that was in the midst of my reading, and you felt the creative energy. And I also read her original children's magazines, Dynamite, and I think Pizzazz was the other one. Mm-hmm. And yeah, those were coming to us in grade school through Scholastic. And they were great, and it doesn't surprise me. It is amazing to learn that she was 23 and taking over DC Comics. Yeah. That's really incredible. My God.
Yeah. She has now got her name on movie credits. And I occasionally run into her, very rarely. It's always a very cordial, pleasant meeting.
That's cool.
She has aged, but haven't we all?
Sure. I understand. Absolutely. Well, again, this is, 40, really, I guess 40, more than 40 years since she took over. Holy cow. Crazy.
Yeah.
And honestly, I appreciate your time. I wondered if you had any thoughts on, we lost a couple big, geek culture icons, and Steve Ditko, you mentioned him earlier, and I know Charlton was the kind of business that likely freelancers didn't necessarily run into each other, but I wondered if you had any Steve Ditko memories or encounters that you wanted to share.
Well, I did not offer to eulogize Steve, though I had great respect for him. I mean, I am occasionally called on to do that, and it's generally something I'm happy to do. But we just so disagreed on so many things.
Sure.
I feel guilty about Steve, and I'll tell you why. Twice I took over characters that he created and changed them drastically, changed them into things that he can't possibly have liked. Well, with the question, when Levitz asked me to do it, I said, I can't write I can't do the kind of story Steve is doing. And he said, do the kind of stories you feel like doing. Well, that was kind of a slap in the face to Steve, though I didn't realize it. And Lenny Ween eventually said, you were going to change it that much. Why didn't you simply create your own character?
Interesting.
It's a good question.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
The answer was that, I was used to doing assignments. This was something that the president of the company assigned to me. And so I did it, as I had been doing for 40 years. But Steve was one of those vehement Ayn Rand people. Yes. I came back from one of the marches on the Pentagon, and I happened to run into him in the office the next day, and he was talking about how those hippies should have been machine guns, and I'm thinking, whoa, I'd have been right in the line of fire.
Wow, yeah.
But that's a problem I have with conservatives of any kind. It's always about violence.
Understood, yeah.
On the other hand, the progressives and liberals don't seem to know what they're doing. So
I share your frustration and do understand. And frankly, we did talk about 12 years ago in our first conversation about how you changed the question. But you did put it in the book that he had his near-death experience and came out of it a changed man. And I can also, did you ever have an opportunity to see him after you started your run, and did you ever exchange words in what you were doing with the character?
No, he was not a sociable man. He pretty much stuck to, my dominant emotion about him, I guess, is pity, because he seemed to be so lonely and so isolated. He had his little cramped studio on 8th Avenue, and I think he lived mostly in a hotel.
Wow.
And was vehement about the Ayn Rand stuff.
Yeah.
Mr. A, yes. There is no gray. There's only black and white. Those people remind me of evangelical Christians. I'm right. There's no point in arguing this. I'm right, and you should die if you don't agree with me.
Wow. Yeah. Jeez. And how about Harlan Ellison? And another pointy man, but man, I loved his stories. And also, as passionate as he was about his points of view, you could never, he was never not entertaining, at the very least.
He was a miraculously good speaker. I once saw him hold an audience of 3,000 people from midnight till 3 a.m. while a projector got fixed at a convention. The movie to be shown was The Boy and His Dog. Yeah, I've wondered about Harlan. I saw him in Atlanta about 5 years ago, and he gave me the Julie Schwartz Lifetime Achievement Award. It was very kind of cool to get that from Carl. And I hadn't spoken to him for 10 years, and I didn't know what the problem was, if any, but he ran across the stage when they read out my name as the winner of this award and told the audience, I haven't seen talk to Denny in 10 years. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's because you disappeared. But he hugged me, and the next day he went out of his way to make sure that I got the seat next to his on the panel about Julie that we did. And I guess we were pretty close friends at one point. When I needed work, he got it for me. Get out here in 48 hours, you can probably write a TV show. And I got out there in 48 hours and wrote the show.
Wow.
He's a man who I think his not inconsiderable talent as a writer, was compromised by his great talent as a stand-up comedian. Because he could get instant gratification that way. Writing is a slow process, as I'm sure you know. And there's a part of you that has to want to close that door behind you for 20 to 30 hours a week. The last writing I know that Harlan did was in public, in a Fifth Avenue bookstore window.
Yes. Go on. Yes.
And he did something similar in Los Angeles. Well, that's okay. I really try hard not to be judgmental anymore. One of my great faults. But that's kind of showing off more than writing. And if you need that kind of stimulation, you have a problem you have to look at. Not pretend it's not there.
Very interesting. Yeah. Now,
so he until about age 35, he was super talent. Also a very good guy to get along with. He was a very good guy to hang out with. Very generous to me in that when I went out to write that CBS show, he had a secret room in his house that you got to by knowing which books on a bookshelf to move. And then it opened, and that was my bedroom for the time it took me to do that CBS
That's
job.
Hilarious. A secret panel led to your bedroom at Harlan's house. I've heard about that secret panel in that room. That's amazing. Denny, I didn't know you wrote television, and can you tell us some of the shows you wrote for?
Well, that one was Logan's Run.
Oh,
It never got broadcast because the show got canceled. I wrote episode 13.
Okay.
The show got canceled after about 10 episodes.
Yeah, I remember as a kid watching the television version of Logan's Run. Sure.
But I got suddenly at a semi-wide hole in my schedule. I had nothing to write. I had no work to do. So I told Harlan, and I just quoted him a little while ago, if you can get out here in 48 hours, it's not too late to get a job. So he lent me his car, and one Sunday morning, or one weekday morning, I went to a movie studio, and I talked to the woman who had been the story editor on Star Trek, and the producer, and I walked out of there with an assignment. And all due to Harlan's generosity.
Wow. Was that D.C. Fontana? Okay. Yeah. The
backstory on that is that when I was kind of a hippie in St. Louis, I and two young women and a friend of mine who was in law school at the time rented a house and, went chipped in on the necessary things. And we were, if there was such a thing as a hippie in St. Louis at the time, we were probably it. And this guy named Mike Ayler passed through town. He was a wandering intellectual, and when we were talking about books with him, he said, well, listen, you want to know a writer, Harlan Ellison. He lays the truth on you so thick you can't stand it. And here's Mike Ayler talking about this guy we never heard of. So we got in my brother's car, and we went to the airport because I knew their bookstore would be open, and Harlan had a book out, and we all got it. So I knew who he was before I got to New York.
Interesting.
And one of the first parties we went to, Annie, my wife, was and I guess is quite beautiful. And so we were at a party, and Harlan hit on her, and she said, "No, I'm married." And he said, "Well, that's all right. Let's get out of here." And she said, "No, Denny ONeil is my husband." Well, I had exchanged letters with Harlan at that point. He said, "Oh, okay. Well, introduce me to Denny." And, we kind of stayed in touch after that.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. Jesus. Too much, man.
I worry about him a little bit because I haven't heard anything about him for about 5 years. And Harlan was a guy that if he was in town, you knew it.
I understand. Yeah.
The young woman I'm having a phone conversation with tomorrow I was gonna meet Harlan for dinner, and a bunch of other people were coming, and I was hanging around with Carol. So I said, why don't you come to dinner? So New York City was in the middle of a blizzard, and I was an hour late getting to the apartment that Harlan was in. So for that hour, Harlan had nothing to do at all but let Carol have both barrels of the charm. By the time I got her, this educated, intellectual, funny woman was totally in his pocket.
I understand, man. No, and as you say, quite a storyteller and quite a charmer all the way. And I loved when he was on the Sci-Fi Channel doing his little commentaries about what was going on in everything. I mean, I remember him commenting on when Marvel was near bankruptcy, and he was really just devastated by it. And we're not going to. Marvel might end up. Who knows? DC might end up getting these characters, and his speculation of what might happen at that point in the late '90s. It was always interesting to hear his point of view.
Yeah, comic books were a gift to him, I think, because it gave him a venue. I don't know why he didn't stick closer to science fiction, because they loved him too, but he became part of the comic book world, and for years DC sent him, as they did me, everything they published. They stopped doing that a couple of years ago.
Yes.
But his house was amazing. If you could just get an hour in Ellison's joint. There was a lot of corners, and around every corner was something you didn't expect to see.
That's amazing. That's great.
A poster or a movie prop or something. And he had, of course, thousands of books and a very extensive comic book collection and a secret panel.
Absolutely, man. Too much. Last time we spoke, you said you were working on a current Batman project. And by the way, if this is something you don't want to tease, we can. I'll stop and we can edit this. But I was curious, and I assume they're going to release it next year for the 80th anniversary of Batman.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff coming up. The 1000th issue of Detective, and Batman shortly thereafter. Yeah, no, I don't mind talking about what I did. I wrote a sequel to There Is No Open Crime Alley, but because the business has loosened up a lot, I got a chance to really write the story you might want to write. Batman is a jerk in this, and without Leslie, he would have done something he could never have forgiven himself for. All in the cause of violence on the side of righteousness. So the kid who edited it said the little speech I gave Leslie about you think you're fighting, you're working against violence, you're actually promoting it because you can't solve a problem without hurting someone. Those are things I might have put in the first story, and I didn't think I'd get away with them then. But I did now. I'm very happy with them. It's probably happier with that and the Christmas story than any comic book work I've done in years. We should also say something about my poor forlorn novel.
Yes, of course.
It's out there, I'm told. I have not as yet signed an autograph, but I have not ventured very far from this house. I'm debating whether or not to give a copy to Carol tomorrow. I don't give away my stuff, but there were two kids who came to the front door, and they knew my address, and they just called to say hello to me because they were comics fans. Just out of nowhere. Yeah, so I gave them a copy of. So we should say that this is a novel that is about 30% autobiographical and is largely about comic books changed from a backwater, disreputable trash genre to something that is taught in most of the major universities in the country. And you can get it from Amazon. Of course, you can get anything from Amazon. But I didn't take any ads out, and everybody told me, including Chuck Dixon, who's had a lot of success doing Amazon publishing, that you have to promote it.
Well, it's called the Perils of Captain Mighty and the Redemption of Danny the Kid. I've got it on my tablet. You and Larry were kind to send me the PDF of it, and no, it's great, Denny. And again, we spoke about it a few months ago, but I'm glad to mention it again, and also the fact that, as you say, you're going to have a handful of copies when you go to Terrificon next month in Connecticut. So a few people will be able to get it there, but it's on Amazon, and you can pick it up as well digitally. And yeah, it's an incredible story, and it's a very personal story. And I am, again, as you said earlier, it maybe went in a direction you weren't planning on going into, but I think it only makes you a much more interesting person to learn a lot of your backstory in this book.
Well, thank you, John. That's very nice of you. I should go relate to the nice lady who's here to make sure I don't fall over and die.
I will let you go. And yes.
So I will talk to you again.
Truly, I appreciate it, Danny, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you next month. And I will let you and Larry know when I put this out. But thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
You bet.
A wonderful conversation with Denny ONeil. Very gracious with his time, as you heard, literally until his caregiver came to help him out. I'm slightly embarrassed by that, but that shows you what kind of mensch Denny is. I can't wait to see him at Terrificon. Again, he'll be there Sunday only, August 19th at Mohegan Sun at Terrificon. I hope you have the opportunity to see him. If you're in the tri-state area, make the drive. It is so worth it. So many great creators and celebrities are going to be at Terrificon. I'm very, very psyched. Yes, they're a sponsor. Yes, I'm doing panels at Terrificon. But I am telling you, one of the reasons why I was really excited to get involved with Mitch's show is because of the incredible lineup that he has. And it's certified by my buddies Art and Franco. And I know if they're dealing with the wonderful people at Terrificon, I know they're all good people. So very, very psyched. Less than 2 weeks away. I hope you'll be able to join me at Terrificon. I'll get into panels on the next episode of Word Balloon. But I can tell you right now, we're going to have a Robin panel on Sunday with Denny and Mike Barr and Pete Tomasi, so many interesting people that have had a chance to write the Robin character. And you consider the evolution of the character, not just Dick Grayson, but Jason Todd, Dick becoming Nightwing, Damian now part of the picture. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation, and I really look forward to doing it live and then presenting it here on Word Balloon. Thanks again, League of Word Balloon listeners, for your support via Patreon. Again, if you'd like to subscribe to Word Balloon, if you like what you hear, think of Word Balloon as your audio-only convention panel that never ends. And it actually goes longer than the 45 minutes we're usually allotted. So we get into some really interesting discussion and conversation about current and comic book history with our wonderful creators that we get to have here on Word Balloon. In the days ahead, can I brag? Why not? Paul Kupperberg is coming up, another great DC writer talking about working in the Bronze Age and well into the 90s. Excellent stories. Man, we get into Vigilante, one of the superheroes that, man, I don't know if this story could happen in today's world. And we talk about it. If you'll remember, Adrian Chase, a true vigilante, much like the Punisher, who wasn't afraid of killing, really had nowhere to go, and finally they killed him. Suicide. Not just killed him by a policeman or a stray bullet or something like that. Vigilante killed himself in the pages of DC. Could they do that story today? I don't think so. Paul talks about that. We talk about his Superman run and a lot of other interesting stuff that I'm sure you're going to enjoy. His website is incredible, paulkupperberg.com. Joelle Jones coming up in the days ahead. the wonderful artist, the wonderful writer who was such an important part of Tom King's Batman run leading up to The Wedding, and now doing wonderful work in the pages of Catwoman, issue 2 coming out in days. And we talk about her Catwoman run. We also talk about Lady Killer and a lot more aspects of Joelle's career. Brian Edward Hill, who is currently killing it on Detective. I loved his run on Postal as well for Top Cow. It's a pleasure to welcome Brian Edward Hill to Word Balloon. Just a few of the great people that are coming in the days and weeks ahead. And then Terrificon comes up. We'll be bringing those panels. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be nothing but Terrificon panels in the post-Terrificon Word Balloon era there in late August and into September. I guarantee you there will also still be new conversations as well with current and past great creators. Very, very excited about what's coming up in August, September, right into October in New York Comic Con. So keep it right here, and I hope you enjoy the content you're hearing on Word Balloon and at wordballoon.com. Don't forget to tell your friends if you like the show. That's the best way you can help me out, is let a friend know, hey, if you like comic books, this is the podcast you need to be listening to. Thanks, everybody, as always, for your attention and support. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2018.